The wind, a relentless surgeon, scoured the skeletal trees, stripping them bare of memory and leaf alike. It howled through the desiccated remnants of the homestead, a dirge for what was no longer there. Alara knew its voice intimately now, a constant companion in the suffocating blackness that had become her world. Below, in the forgotten maw of the well, the earth exhaled a chill that bit to the bone. She clung to Lena, her small, cold sister, a fragile anchor in the abyss, the stiffening weight a testament to the days that had blurred into an endless, crushing night. Hunger was a dull ache, thirst a rasping fire in her throat, but fear, sharp and crystalline, was her only true sustenance, kept her conscious, if not alive. Above, a shadow fell, not the familiar, mocking silhouette of the well's mouth, but something broader, obscuring the sliver of sky that had been her only window to a world she no longer belonged to. A voice, deep and gravelly, sliced through the wind's lament. "Hello? Anyone down there?" It was not kind, not cruel, merely present. Alara's breath hitched. She tightened her grip on Lena, pressing her face into the damp, coarse fabric of her sister's dress, praying to be unseen, unheard, a ghost among the other ghosts. But the voice persisted, closer now, accompanied by the creak of old wood. "Gods above, by all that's holy," the words were rough, an exhalation of disbelief. A rope, thick and chafed, descended, snaking blindly into the void. Alara flinched as it brushed her cheek, a rough, living thing. She squeezed her eyes shut. She heard the man above, his heavy boots crunching on the loose shale, the strained grunts as he leaned into something unseen. He was pulling at the well's old frame, testing its stability. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the frantic thrum of her own heart. Then, a new sound, the methodical clink of metal against stone, the scrape of a shovel. He was clearing the debris around the wellhead, preparing. Preparing for what? To fill it? To bury them? Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She wanted to scream, to rail against the injustice, but her throat was too dry, her will too frayed. Finally, the voice again, closer still, edged with an almost reluctant command. "There's a loop. Get your arm in it." Child Alara opened her eyes, startled. He knew she was here. His form, silhouetted against the weak, gray light, was imposing, his shoulders broad, his hat pulled low. Silas. That was the name the townspeople had whispered with a mix of fear and dismissiveness. The silent man, the loner, the one who kept to the high country. He had not abandoned her, not yet. Slowly, tentatively, her fingers, stiff and numb, fumbled for the rope. She could not release Lena. The thought was an unbearable agony. She shook her head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. A frustrated sigh escaped Silas, a plume of white in the cold air. The rope swayed. Then he was descending, not with a harness, but carefully, hand over hand, his heavy boots finding precarious purchase on the slick, moss-covered stones. He was larger than she had imagined, a looming, dark shape against the faint light from above. He reached her, his breath a warm, living cloud against her face. His eyes, though shadowed by the brim of his hat, were unsettlingly direct, not with pity, but with a stark, unsettling determination. He saw Lena, and a flicker, something akin to pain or grim recognition, crossed his face before it was shuddered away. "The other one," he said, his voice softer now. "She's gone, isn't she?" It wasn't a question, but a statement of brutal fact. Alara could only nod, tears, long since dried, stinging her eyes anew. He didn't offer comfort, only action. His hands, large and calloused, moved with surprising gentleness, securing her to him with a separate length of rope, one arm carefully supporting her, the other still on the main line. He didn't force her to let go of Lena, but carefully adjusted her so that her sister, too, was cradled against her as he began the slow, arduous climb back towards the light, pulling them both from the earth's cold embrace. The effort was immense, his muscles straining, a silent testament to a will that would not break. The light, when it finally broke through the black veil, was blinding, harsh, and utterly alien. Alara gasped, a thin, reedy sound, her eyes recoiling from the vast, indifferent sky. Silas pulled them free, a heave of immense strength, and laid them gently on the unforgiving ground. He did not linger, did not offer words of solace. Instead, he moved with the efficient, practiced motions of a man accustomed to grim tasks. He found a piece of canvas, rough and stained, and covered Lena with it, a final, unadorned shroud. Alara watched him, her mind a numb fog, her body a collection of aches and shivers. He then lifted her, not with tenderness, but with the practical ease of carrying a sack of flour. She was too weak to resist, too cold to care. The journey to his cabin was a blur of jostling and the rhythmic thud of Silas's boots. She registered the scent of pine and damp earth, the biting cold that seeped through her thin clothes. When he set her down, it was on a rough cot inside a small, sparsely furnished cabin, smelling of wood smoke, dust, and something earthy, a hunter's den. A fire crackled in the hearth, throwing dancing shadows on the log walls, a beacon of warmth in a world that had forgotten it. Silas placed a tin cup of steaming water, laced with a hint of bitterness from an herb, into her trembling hands. "Drink," he commanded, his voice gruff but low. For days, Alara existed in a state of suspended animation. She ate the tasteless stew he provided, felt the warmth of the fire on her skin, watched him move about his solitary routines. He spoke little, his rare words practical instructions or observations about the weather. He mended a tear in her tattered dress with clumsy but careful stitches. He brought her a thick, wool blanket that smelled faintly of dog and campfire. There was no pity in his gaze, only a watchful, unyielding presence. He was a guardian forged of necessity, not affection. Her grief for Lena was a leaden weight in her chest, but beneath it, a tiny, defiant spark began to glow. She had survived. She was warm. She was fed. She watched Silas, how he meticulously cleaned his rifle, how he split wood with powerful, economical swings, how he tended to his snares. He was a man of the wilderness, shaped by its unforgiving laws, devoid of the soft edges of town dwellers. He made no demands, asked no questions of her past, a silent agreement that it was too painful to touch. One evening, as twilight bled across the windowpane, Silas sat by the fire, sharpening a hunting knife. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel was the only sound. Alara, huddled in her blanket, watched him. His face, usually a mask of granite, softened almost imperceptibly as a small, injured bird, its wing askew, fluttered weakly outside the window. He rose, moved with surprising swiftness, and carefully scooped it up. He returned to the fire, fashioning a splint from a twig and a strip of cloth. His hands, which had so effortlessly pulled her from the well, were now delicately mending a fragile life. It was then, seeing the unexpected gentleness in his rugged hands, that a sliver of her fear began to chip away. He was not cruel. He was merely quiet, and he cared, in his own stoic way, for the small, broken things. Alara's eyes, wide and unervingly old, met his across the flickering flames. She didn't speak, but her gaze held a question, a tentative curiosity that he seemed to acknowledge with a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He placed the mended bird in a small, woven basket near the hearth. "It'll mend," he murmured, his voice rough. It was the first time he had offered a hint of hope, a whisper of a future beyond mere survival. And in that moment, for the first time since the well, Alara felt a faint, unfamiliar warmth bloom in her chest, not just from the fire, but from the quiet presence of this silent man. A fragile thread, spun from shared silence and unspoken understanding, began to stretch between them. Winter descended with a vengeance, a white shroud silencing the already desolate landscape. The cabin became their entire world, a small island of warmth against the relentless siege of snow and ice. The wind, once a distant wail, now shrieked against the windows, rattling the very foundations of their fragile sanctuary. Supplies, carefully hoarded by Silas, began to dwindle. The forest, usually a source of sustenance, was now a frozen, unforgiving tomb. The growing scarcity forced Alara to observe Silas with a new intensity. She saw the lines of worry deepen around his eyes, the subtle tension in his jaw. He was constantly calculating, conserving, pushing himself harder. He would venture out into the blizzard, returning hours later, caked in snow, his shoulders hunched against the biting cold, often with nothing but frostbite clinging to his beard. He never complained. He simply endured. One brutal morning, the blizzard intensified to a blinding whiteout. Silas had been out since before dawn, checking a desperate trap line further into the hills. Alara, tending the dwindling fire, felt an unfamiliar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. The cabin felt too large, too empty without his solid presence. Hours dragged by. The light faded, swallowed by the swirling snow. Doubt, cold and sharp, began to creep in. He should have returned. He always returned. She found herself pacing, a nervous energy she hadn't known she possessed. She peered through the frosted window, seeing nothing but a maelstrom of white. A distant, faint cry, carried on the wind, pierced the roar of the storm. It was barely audible, a desperate sound. Alara hesitated for only a moment. Fear still gnawed at her, but something else, a nascent loyalty, a need to repay the unspoken debt, pushed her forward. She grabbed the heaviest coat Silas owned, far too large for her, and pulled on his thickest boots, stumbling as she tied the laces. The world outside was a terrifying, formless void. "Silas?" she shouted, her voice thin and swallowed by the gale. The wind tore the word from her lips. She trudged forward, one step at a time, guided only by the direction of the faint cry, the blizzard's icy fingers clawing at her exposed skin. She fell, picked herself up, snow filling her boots, chilling her to the bone. She pushed through drifts that rose above her waist, her small hands raw from the cold. She found him by the old rockfall, partially buried in a drift. His leg twisted at an unnatural angle beneath a fallen branch. His rifle lay buried in the snow beside him. He was conscious, his face pale and grim, but his eyes held a glimmer of surprise at her presence. "Child, what are you doing?" he rasped, his voice raw with pain and cold. "You didn't come back," she stated, her breath a ragged plume. She didn't waste time with questions. She began to claw at the snow and the branches, her fingers numb, but fueled by a fierce, unfamiliar resolve. She pulled at the heavy branch that pinned his leg, grunting with effort, her small frame straining. He watched her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, shock, perhaps, or a grudging respect. "It's no good, Alara," he finally managed, his voice thick. "It's too heavy." But she didn't stop. She saw a thick, sturdy piece of timber nearby, partially buried. With a desperate surge of strength, she leveraged it, gritting her teeth, using it as a lever against the branch. Slowly, agonizingly, the branch shifted, groaning under the pressure. Silas let out a sharp gasp of pain, but the leg was free. He grimaced, pulling himself up, leaning heavily on her small shoulder. He tried to stand, but his leg buckled. We need to get back," he managed, leaning on her, his arm over her shoulders, his weight immense. Alara, though small, became his crutch, his anchor in the storm. Step by agonizing step, she guided him, one arm supporting him, the other dragging his rifle, back towards the faint, flickering light of the cabin, the blizzard swirling around them like a hungry beast. The silent man and the small girl, a fragile, unbreakable unit against the fury of the world. The storm raged for another day, but they were inside, safe. Silas, his leg crudely splinted by his own hand with Alara's hesitant assistance, lay by the fire, his face pale, but his eyes still sharp. Alara, exhausted but strangely exhilarated, tended to him, fetching water, feeding the dwindling fire, and applying the poultices he instructed her to make from his meager store of dried herbs. The roles had subtly, irrevocably shifted. She was no longer just the rescued, but a participant, a partner in their shared survival. As the days passed and Silas's legs slowly began to heal, a new dynamic settled between them. The austere silence that had defined their early days softened. He still spoke little, but his gaze held a new depth, an unspoken gratitude that resonated more profoundly than any words. He watched her as she swept the cabin floor, as she carefully mended his torn coat, her small hands surprisingly deft. He saw the resilience that had been forged in the crucible of the well, tempered by the long, lonely nights and the recent battle against the storm. The ghost of the terrified, clinging child was slowly, steadily being replaced by a quiet, capable girl. One afternoon, as the first tentative signs of thaw began to appear outside the drip of melting snow from the eaves, the return of a lone, hopeful Robin Alara found herself by the hearth, drawing in the dirt floor with a stick. She etched a crude outline of a small figure, then another, smaller one holding its hand. She paused, her finger tracing the outline of the tiny figure, her throat tight. "Lena," she whispered, the name a fragile breath into the quiet air. It was the first time she had spoken her sister's name aloud since she had been pulled from the well. Silas, who had been whittling by the window, stopped. He didn't look at her immediately, but his silence was attentive, a gentle, unwavering presence. He waited. Alara's eyes filled, but no tears fell. The raw, desperate grief had mellowed into a tender ache, a part of her, but no longer all of her. She looked up at Silas, her gaze clear. She would have liked it here, Alara said, her voice stronger than she expected. The quiet, the birds. Silas slowly lowered his knife. He met her gaze, and for the first time, Alara saw not just stoicism, but a deep, quiet understanding in his eyes. He saw the child she was, and the woman she would become. He saw the echoes of his own past, perhaps, of losses he had never mourned. He simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement that spoke volumes. "Perhaps," he murmured, his voice gruffer than usual, as if battling an unfamiliar emotion. He then returned to his whittling, but the rhythmic scrape of the blade seemed softer, less driven by solitude, more by companionship. The land outside shed its winter skin, revealing the promise of spring. Alara began to venture out with Silas, not just to gather wood, but to learn the names of the plants, the tracks of the animals. He taught her to read the subtle signs of the wilderness, to hunt, to fish, skills not offered in words, but patiently demonstrated, observed, and slowly mastered. She no longer clung to him out of fear, but walked beside him out of choice, a silent, comfortable partnership. Silas, the gruff loner who had pulled a broken child from a cold well, was indeed never the same. The raw, visceral memory of that day had shattered the walls he had built around himself, revealing a hidden wellspring of compassion and purpose. He had not sought a companion, nor a daughter, but in saving Alara, he had unknowingly saved a part of himself. The shadow that had followed him, the quiet despair of a life lived apart, had begun to lift, replaced by the steady glow of a shared existence. They were two broken pieces, once adrift, now fitting together, not perfectly, but truly, building a life not from the ruins of the past, but from the hard-won dignity of their present, facing the vast, indifferent world not as individuals, but as an unbreakable, quiet unit. The well, once a symbol of death and despair, had become their unlikely beginning.